all. My name is Christian Alexander. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the International Security and Terrorism Program at Trends Research and Advisory, and today's moderator of the event. On behalf of Trends Research and Advisory, one of the UAE's most vibrant and independent think tanks in the region, I would like to welcome all of the esteemed speakers along with our online attendees to our e-symposium entitled Think Tanks from Foreseeing to Participation in Building the Future. Before we commence, I would like to give the floor to our CEO of Trends, Dr. Muhammad Abdullah Al-Ali, for some welcoming remarks in Arabic. Please, Dr. Ali.
Thank you, Dr. Christian. السادة الرؤساء ومديرو المراكز الفكرية والخبراء المشاركون، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسعدني أن أرحب بكم جميعاً وأشكر لكم تلبيتكم دعوة ترندز للبحوث والاستشارات للمشاركة في هذه المائدة المستديرة، والتي تأتي ضمن الاهتمام الذي يوليه مركز ترندز لتعزيز التعاون والتنسيق بين مراكز الفكر والدراسات حول العالم لمواجهة التحديات المشتركة التي تواجه عمل هذه المراكز، والعمل معاً من أجل الوصول إلى رؤى وتفاهمات وأفكار مشتركة وبناءة لخدمة كافة الدول والمجتمعات في تحقيق النهضة والسلام والازدهار. أود هنا أن أنوه إلى أن المنتدى المهم الذي عقده ترندز نهاية شهر يوليو الماضي بالتنسيق والشراكة مع برنامج مراكز الفكر والمجتمعات المدنية التابع لمعهد لودر في جامعة بنسلفانيا على أرض الواقع في دبي، وشارك فيه ممثلو ما يقارب عن 30 مؤسسة بحثية عالمية لمناقشة التحديات الاستراتيجية والتنفيذية التي تواجهها مراكز البحوث في استقطابها المواهب والاحتفاظ بهم. كما يأتي هذا المنتدى استكمالا للمائدة المستديرة التي عقدها المركز العام الماضي، وشارك فيها ممثلو 15 مؤسسة بحثية عالمية وإقليمية. ولا شك في أن زيادة عدد المشاركين في مائدة اليوم مقارنة بالعام الماضي إنما هو دليل على نجاح مسعانا لتأسيس منصة تواصل وتنسيق مشترك بين المراكز البحثية عبر العالم، وهو أمر نفتخر به. الحضور الكريم، لقد أكدت جائحة كوفيد-19 والتأثيرات التي فرضتها على العالم كله أن قدرة مراكز الفكر على استشراف المستقبل ما تزال تواجه تحديات عدة، وهو ما يتطلب منا التفكير في الأدوات والمناهج التي يمكن أن تسهم في تعزيز قدراتنا على التنبؤ بالأحداث وتحديد مساراتها المستقبلية. ولن تكتفي هذه الحلقة النقاشية اليوم فقط بطرح التحديات التي تواجه قدرتنا على استشراف المستقبل، وإنما نسعى من خلالها أيضاً إلى طرح بعض الأفكار والتصورات التي يمكن أن تساعد في تحويل مؤسساتنا البحثية من مراكز للفكر إلى مراكز للتغيير، أي تطوير دور هذه المراكز من استشراف المستقبل إلى المشاركة في صنعه. مرة أخرى أشكركم جميعاً، وأثق تماماً في أن الأفكار التي سيتم طرحها هنا ستساعدنا على تطوير قدراتنا في استشراف المستقبل والمشاركة في بنائه. والآن أعطي الكلمة للدكتور كريستيان اسكندر، مدير برنامج الأمن الدولي والإرهاب في ترندز للبحوث والاستشارات، لتولي إدارة هذه الحلقة النقاشية المهمة. شكرا لكم جميعا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. In today's session, we seek to address and unpack several themes. How do think tanks foresee the future? What are some of the challenges in an uncertain world of the think tank community? What type of strategies can be proposed in order to deal with these challenges? And lastly, how can think tanks cooperate more closely in order to build a more sustainable future? I would like to remind all panelists, 19 total as far as the recent count goes, from all corners of the world, that they have approximately 4 to 5 minutes for their brief remarks. Obviously, they may share or address their thoughts on some of the questions that were forwarded to them, or just speak freely about their views of the future of think tanks, some of the challenges they anticipate, opportunities for cooperation and collaboration. I will very briefly introduce each one of our panelists and then give them the floor for about 4 to 5 minutes. And I will call on you in no particular order, just based on the list that I was given from the management. I would kindly ask you to adhere to the timeline so we can entertain some questions from the audience and our viewers, and hopefully engage in a bit of a discussion during our Q&A period later on. Rest assured that I will remind you just before your time is up. Thank you very much. And we'll commence with our first speaker, that is Dr. Iyad Mohsen Al-Dajani, the Executive and Research Director at the Academic Alliance for Reconciliation at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, Germany. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Alex, for having me, and thank Trans for having me to speak about the Academic Alliance for Reconciliation in Middle East and North Africa. I'll try to be as brief as I can. I would like to share with you a PowerPoint. It's not a PowerPoint presentation within like this 4 or 5 minutes to show you exactly what we do at the Academic Alliance for Reconciliation in Middle East and North Africa. So, we are part of Friedrich Schiller University. As you see, we are co-funded by the Erasmus+, but mostly of our work is third funded, and that's how we work. We develop research projects with higher education institutions in Middle East and North Africa. We develop research symposiums, exchange of knowledge between higher education institutions, professors, scholars, and students from all around the world that are interested in the Middle East and North Africa in developing reconciliation and peace building in the middle of conflict. So we work according to developing research skills. We do as well strengthening strategic partnership in higher education institutions between the MENA regions, universities with Europe, and also with the US. We do this, what we call it transdisciplinary research. When we connect the triangular higher education institution, Europe, Middle East, North Africa. This is our triangular of work. As you see, I can take you just in the middle of 2018, how we started in the conferences, symposium. Then we had membership and some projects with Palestinian universities, Arab universities. We also have other conferences that had 107 professors at the same time, which was online, and it was Heritage, Reconciliation, and Social Inclusion. And now we are publishing 2 books about the subjects. One book, the first was published, Reconciliation with Refugees, and now we are publishing Heritage and Reconciliation, Social Inclusion as well. And we have other projects that today that we're working capacity building in higher education institutions in Jordan, Algeria, and Palestine, as well in Lebanon, Tunis, as well Libya with Musrata, and different other higher education institutions. We cooperate also with European universities as well and American universities. These are the Armenia members. As you see here, we have over 25 universities that are members from the MENA region. We have about over 45 higher education institutions. We are working with higher education institutions. So we work with professors and scholars, but our mains as well in higher education institutions. I'll go back here just in a second just to see what we really do. So here how we do it. We have symposium, workshops, training programs, summer schools, curriculum development, joint project, and then we do symposiums and publications with those universities. And then we have as well, here is our website as well. And then we develop different strategies. Like today we have curriculum building in peace and master program in University of Jordan, Petra University, Algerian universities, Tunisian universities in peace and reconciliation studies. And we invite them like in August, 7 August, we did a conference with the IRS, the World Conference on Reconciliation in Tokyo, and we brought all those MENA regions of professors to speak about how to develop reconciliation in higher education institutions. So what we do is we develop the hierarchy triangle from connecting the middle ground levels with the upper roots, with down roots, and with the grassroots and with the stakeholders. And this is by tackling the education in the higher education institutions in the country itself, and we disseminate it among their students, professors, and now we are working in different fields. We have projects with Erasmus+, we have projects with the EU, we have with the German Science Foundation, and we are different scholars and different professors from different fields. And our core is develop the reconciliation studies as a transdisciplinary. So we have students from economy, political science, education, computer science, information technology, data science, so all social sciences, security as well, and they are all from different places around the world. And now, as I see, we are working, and it is really planting the seeds for reconciliation and peace building in the Middle East and North Africa, and that's our hope. And thank you so much for having me. This is what I wanted to add.
Thank you, Dr. Iyad, for this very brief and insightful overview of your program. We'll move on to the next discussant, Ms. Aya Al-Kabariti, who's the program manager at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada. Please.
Hello, good morning. It's 9 a.m. in Canada. I'd like to start just by introducing myself. My name is Aya. I'm the program manager at the Center for International Governance Innovation, also known as CIGI. CIGI is an independent, nonpartisan think tank that aims to address significant global issues at the intersection of technology and international governance through building bridges between knowledge and power. Over the years, CIGI has built a diverse network of fellows from different backgrounds to conduct multifaceted research and analysis and generate groundbreaking governance solutions. In order to make a difference, CIGI made a strategic decision to hone in on three main governance pillars: data-driven economy, digital threats to democracy and security, and the modernization of global institutions. I think I would like to, just as Dr. Mohammed mentioned, reiterate that the COVID pandemic presented a significant case for the important role that think tanks could play, not only in terms of providing policy support to respond to certain issues, but in terms of anticipating different scenarios and implications, conducting risk analysis, and presenting innovative solutions and actionable recommendations in a timely manner. And I think that this piece is also going to become even more important in the years to come. So I started thinking about the guiding questions and I guess the agenda items that you shared with us. And I have a few thoughts that I would like to share in the time that I have. I feel like the new and emerging social, political, and economic realities are really testing our creativity and innovation in terms of the work that we produce, in terms of how we produce it, why we produce it, and also how we ensure that we have the resources to be able to do that. So I believe that the main thing will continue to be for think tanks to evolve in their adaptability and flexibility when it comes to their structures, their functions, and their outreach. This will also prompt changes when it comes to think tank sizes, their areas of work, the skills and expertise that they draw on. And it will encourage more thought into what policy areas we would like to influence, what goals are we trying to achieve, and what impact are we anticipating, which will all feed into how we approach things moving forward. I think that we can all agree that producing high quality research is not sufficient in this age and time. It's also important to know how we strategically communicate it, how we incorporate diversity of approach and analysis, as well as how we incorporate agile responses to timely issues and debates. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. I feel like technology and the sort of the new normalization of virtual communication will really help facilitate that. It will help us sort of expand the stakeholder segments that we reach out to. It will help us with cross-institution, cross-country, cross-discipline communication across through, something like this session, for example, whereby you are drawing from expertise around the world just, by signing in and just having this conversation. I also feel that the pandemic really highlighted how crucial it is to inform and engage with the public, and not only in a one-way sort of stream whereby we sort of help inform through our research and recommendations what they know about a certain topic or how they know about it, but also to be attentive and responsive to certain discussions that they're having, to be able to produce work that's actually relevant, not only to policymakers, but to their constituencies. And I guess I would also like to make a point about how I anticipate that think tanks will become more diverse and inclusive on different levels. First, in their approaches, what types of expertise they are employing, how they are producing the content, and how they're making it more accessible and digestible to the different stakeholders that they're including. I've also witnessed more think tanks, for example, connecting with the private sector, which I believe that is a relatively new trend, let's say, but will have implications on how we produce research, what types of research agendas are we putting in, and how we frame the recommendations to be able to really tick what is needed. And finally, I believe that all of these factors will definitely encourage us to do more global work and partnerships through, the technology that's making that easier across the different countries, but also to tackle global issues from different perspectives by sharing case studies, by working on presenting success stories, and by also comparing and drawing on the different approaches that we use to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aya. Let's move on to Dr. Omar Al-Obaidli, who's the Director of Studies and Research and the Director of Economics and Energy Studies at the Bahrain Center for Strategic International and Energy Studies, Darasat in Bahrain. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about MENA think tanks and how they might evolve over the coming period. So MENA think tanks have, first of all, I wish to thank Trends for the invitation to participate today. I'm very much honored to be on such a distinguished panel. MENA think tanks have a fundamental weakness they need to address if they wish to improve their productivity and realize their missions. They want to influence policy, which is more or less the definition of a think tank. But the reality is that in many countries in MENA, the think tanks cannot openly criticize any government policy. And too often they're stuck exposing or describing government policy or just reinforcing it, rather than providing critical analysis of that government policy. There are many reasons for this. I'm not going to go through all the reasons, but one of them is culture. In all MENA organizations in the Middle East region, whether you're talking about businesses, universities, whatever, something small as a small youth club all the way up to a ministry, there's a culture of not drawing attention to potential problems, especially when you're engaging people from outside the organization. If you see a weakness in the organization, you're just supposed to shut up. And when you talk outside the organization, you're supposed to say that everything's great, everything's fine. Even within the family unit, it's the same attitude. It's a very pervasive part of the culture in the region. And as a result, MENA think tanks have an extremely limited capacity to affect government policy, unlike counterparts in OECD countries, many of which are represented in today's panel. So whereas an American think tank can take a strong position against a government policy and take steps in affecting that government policy, you will very rarely find a MENA think tank taking a strong position against its government's policy and being able to influence policy. This also results in them having extremely low levels of credibility internationally. And this is reflected in the citation rates of their research output, which are really low. So, I mean, when you see MENA think tanks, so when you see a Western think tank talking about its success, it'll say, look, we wrote this paper and this led to this policy change, or our paper was cited in this congressional hearing or in this testimony or something like that. In MENA think tanks, all you see is think tanks talking about how many papers they wrote or how many events they organized. But if you actually look at those papers, are they cited? Do they either locally or internationally? And the citation rates, I would say that my guess, I haven't collected the data, but my guess is the citation, the modal and median citation rate for a think tank output paper of a Middle Eastern think tank is 0. Once it gets written, probably very few people read it, and even those who read it don't cite it. And this is a chronic problem, and this reflects a deep limitations on the level of quality and of the ability of these things to influence output. How do you need to solve this? Well, over the coming years, in the next 20 years, going back to the main theme of this session, what you need to do is you need to have a broader cultural change in society. You need to normalize the act of somebody in an organization describing problems in that organization as a step towards addressing those problems. So if I work in the Ministry of X, or if I work in certain business and I think there's a weakness in the way management is operating that, instead of saying everything's fine and writing a paper about how excellent everything is and how wise the decisions of my CEO are, there needs to be a change in the culture whereby people are able to say, well, actually, I think that we have a bad HR policy, or I think our logistics network is not working effectively, or something along those lines. And once this becomes normalized, then it will be reflected in think tanks too, and they can start to produce research that is significantly more influential, because there's a big need for think tanks in the Middle East, especially with so many of the economies undergoing a deep transition. If you're going through a deep transition, you need critical analysis, especially with some of these transitions being unprecedented in nature. They're not following a linear and mature development path. They're having to try new things. And if you're not having to try new things, you need to have the most intelligent people in your society able to provide you input, critical input in an open environment. So there's a big return to be had for the societies if they can engineer this cultural change. And I hope that it happens. And if they do, then think tanks will be big winners. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Omar, for your views on the situation of MENA think tanks. I hope we get back to that later on at some point. Next in line is Ms. Liliana Alvarado, who is the Executive Director of Ethos Public Policy Lab in Mexico, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you so much. So first of all, I'd like to thank Trends Research and Advisory for the invitation to this roundtable. It is a great honor to be amongst such distinguished guests, and also I see some familiar faces. Like you said, my name is Liliana Alvarado. I'm the Executive Director at Ethos Public Policy Lab. And here at Ethos, our main research areas are anti-corruption, public finance, public-private partnerships, PPPs, public health with an emphasis on tobacco control, and sustainable development at a federal and also at a municipal level. I would like to start by speaking about think tanks and new approaches to foreseeing the future. In my opinion, in the past, think tanks focused their work mainly on conducting research that was reflected whether on policy briefs or also on publications, and whose inputs were obtained through secondary research. However, I have to say that as time has gone by, many think tanks have evolved, and now some of our inputs come from face-to-face interviews, but also I would say that cross-referencing databases and also big data analysis. For example, not too long ago at Ethos, we actually organized a couple of hackathons, an activity which I have to say was very, very different from our traditional work. And on both occasions, the idea was mainly to involve young people in the development of mobile applications that could be useful in the fight against corruption. In the same way, I have to say that some of our products have changed and are no longer publications as such. For example, microsites, we have microsites that are separate now from our website. However, to face the challenges of an increasingly complex and uncertain world, I would say that it is crucial that think tanks deepen their understanding and also use of technological tools in order to make a better, I would say, and also more adequate diagnostics and analysis. It is important to be able to keep up with the right technology, to continue communicating through existing and new channels in the future. We all know that as a consequence of the pandemic, we are using more technological tools such as online platforms for almost all of our activities, like internal communication, networking with other actors, dissemination of knowledge, among many other activities. So it is important to keep up with these changes because they impact think tanks' core activities, and those who do not manage to adapt will probably lose many opportunities. However, it is important to mention that technology can present challenges. Simply put, technology is expensive, and sometimes not all think tanks have the resources to undertake training on technological issues. So it is up to us to overcome those challenges in order to adapt to what are the future needs. Additionally, when thinking about the future of think tanks, it is important to consider widening also the institution's work perspective. At this point, I would like to share with you that at Ethos, since 2019, we have complemented our research with journalistic work, which has, I would say, given like a human face to the problems that we have detected throughout our analysis. For example, not long ago, we published a report on the risks of corruption in water management in Mexico. And we did complement that analysis with a report on a low-income neighborhood where a large amount of money was spent to bring water to homes, and how this never happened due to, obviously, irregularities and corruption. And without a doubt, these types of reports increase the impact of our work, and they represent the way in which we can actually differentiate Ethos from other think tanks. And the last element I would like to touch upon would be the importance of having think tanks engage with many other actors across sectors and at the different levels of government, whether global, regional, national, or local. And this is crucial to keep strengthening networks and partnerships to implement projects that include a multitude of visions and also experiences. So I would say that in a nutshell, technology, journalistic reports, and collaborative projects are three approaches that, in my opinion, are relevant when thinking about the future of think tanks. And I'm sure that in the following interventions, we will all have more time to elaborate on these approaches and others that have already been mentioned by my colleagues. Thank you very much.
If I could just mention the research that Liliana mentioned, I don't think MENA think tanks, most of them would be able to conduct the research that she described there. They'd have to do something completely different. Thank you.
Thank you, Liliana and Omar, for your points. May I call on Dr. John Bruni, who's the founder and chief executive officer of SAGE International in Australia, please.
Yes, good evening from down here in Adelaide, South Australia. I'm John. I have been here once before for the first Trends Think Tank symposium, and I thank the organizers for having me back. Look, I won't labor the point in terms of what we do. I mean, in a nutshell, we're really a think tank that is focusing on the Indo-Pacific and making sure that both from a maritime perspective as well as from cyber and space perspective, we can keep the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific free and open for all people to benefit from. One of the things that I've noticed in the conversation so far, and I'd like to pick up on Dr. Omar's point, I mean, I have worked in the Middle East before, so I understand exactly what he was saying in terms of think tanks not being able to really hit their stride, so to speak. But think tanks generally, just outside of the MENA region, I mean, we have to be very mindful. Who do we serve? We serve government. That's a key point here. We can't escape it. And if we don't serve government, then in certain quarters of the world, we have political parties that may be we're very strongly affiliated towards, whether it be conservative, liberal, or some such. And because most of us are basically trained as scholars, and objectivity is the critical feature of our learning, I think that one of the biggest challenges that we face at the moment in the think tank community internationally is to go back to basics, go back to scholarship, and go back to objectivity, to try to depoliticize the kind of things that we do. We do research We're meant to be a support base for government. We're not meant to be monstered by government. We're not meant to be told by political parties what we ought to be saying. This is an international issue that's been of great concern to me over the last 2 or 3 years. And, you know, we see that even here in Australia. You know, OECD countries, I will have to say, Dr. Omar, are not, they don't have clean hands when it comes to, you know, the idea of political interference. It's maybe a much more subtle form than in other parts of the world, but we still do have that. And what we need to do is we need to be able to pull ourselves back, go back to scholarship, and try to figure out what it is that we can do to speak truth to power, because that's what they are meant to be paying us for. You know, it strikes me odd. We all sit down and we all say, well, you know, this is all very nice, and certain parts of the world do certain things a certain way and other parts do it. No, we're all human beings in the end. And, you know, some are a little bit more clever in the way that we can sort of move in various circles to get certain things across. But in the end, I think that, you know, we all suffer from the slings and arrows of fate because it's difficult when, you know, think tanks rely on government for support. And at the point at which we get the support from government, at what point are we then obliged to do what the paymaster requires of us, even if the evidence that we're looking at says that perhaps we need to do something else? And maybe government won't like what we have to say. So, you know, there's one challenge. Another challenge, of course, is, and I think one of my colleagues was saying something about the nature that we, you know, the technology, the disruptive nature of our technology. And believe you me, I mean, I'm sure that I speak for most of us here. I would rather be in Abu Dhabi doing this as opposed to being in Fortress Australia, where I can't go anywhere. And the border closures are not just external, they're also internal. So for me to go to Canberra is a very difficult exercise. So COVID has been very disruptive. Technology does help, but it's not the same as face-to-face communication. We all deal with sensitive material. And sensitive material means that, yes, you know, from our respective positions, if we know each other, if we already have a pre-existing network, if we know who we're dealing with, we can read what the other person requires, because communication is not just a two-dimensional screen. It's also about being able to see the other person, to use a really bad Bushism, to look into their soul, to find out what they really want. This kind of thing is a convenient, it's a band-aid strip while we're going through a global pandemic. Eventually, we hopefully will get back to business as usual, where we can travel, where we can make those human connections with people, and then we can really sort of get down to brass tacks. Finally, I think the other big challenge that we in the think tank community have is also with regard to technology, data protection. You know, everyone is using, you know, their various platforms, and look, you know, some of them are very good, I will say. I'm quite mercenary when it comes to the use of these platforms. I use them all. But in the end, it doesn't matter how much you spend on whatever data protection measures you have, there are always going to be vulnerabilities, because people are consistently hacking these processes, which could corrupt data. It could corrupt the nature of the business. So again, these are the main points that I would like to actually raise in terms of discussion. So Christian, thanks very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bruni, and I hope we can get back to some of the points that you raised and maybe expand our discussion here later on. I would like to now ask Dr. Anna Dolits, sorry for mispronouncing this, Associate Professor and Lead Researcher in Policing and Security at the Rabdan Academy, our neighbors here in Abu Dhabi.
Hi, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to take part in the Trends event for the first time, but hopefully not the last time. It's a pleasure to be invited. I myself speak from the vantage point of having worked for a couple of think tanks myself, being from the Republic of Georgia by nationality, but having lived in States for a long time, and both also as a person who has held high government posts in a developing country for a number of years. So this is a synthesis of couple of points from these perspectives, and I hope they will be useful. Not that you might not have heard of them before. I'm sure this might, for some of you, this will be just a repetition, but anyways, from my point of trying to be helpful. So I think, well, indeed, one of the areas and one of the points in time where think tanks can be incredibly useful, of course, is the time of crisis. Because as we all know, those of us that have worked in the government, in normal times, also, the currency of time is probably the most rare and the most wanted currency for government officials. Time is valuable in general, and the time to set aside and to close your study or office and to think is a luxury in normal times, in normal governments. And if you add to that the moment of crisis where everything is unknown, nobody knows what's going on, how you don't want to, that's important, you really don't want to appear weak as a government. And yet the truth is that you really don't know how to handle the situation, or unless before you find the right people who know, this is the moment where think tanks can be incredibly useful. Because if we are good as part of the think tank, then we are paid to think of outside deadlines and be before the pressure and before the crisis arrives. So this is the time when think tanks can thrive, when they appear at the right time and the right place with their policy suggestions and findings. So COVID could have been, the times of COVID for many governments and for many think tanks could have been incredible. I remember a time when I was in the Ministry of Defense, for instance, to tell a short story, and there was a threatening video released from one of the unknown locations. And this was a time where immediately there was, thinking, do we get to the Security Council? Do we go to the Ministry of Security? Actually, who's in charge of this issue? Who's in charge of the video? And if you have people who have thought of the, let's call it, how to respond to terrorist threats, or soft power responses to terrorist threats, if these proposals had been on the table right there, right in time, of course, that's where certain usefulness would have been increased. Of course, the second, in response to the debate here, fortunately or unfortunately, one of the measures how think tanks are measured is and evaluated is how their recommendations are implemented. If you're useful, if your recommendations are implemented, you are valued as more useful, and you get therefore more funding and appreciation than others. So that's from what point I arrive. It's inevitable. Think tanks are evaluated based on the degree of implementation of their recommendations. And here I would suggest two more things to all the thinking out there to avoid the so-called cookie cutter approach. You come from UK to a developing country like Georgia or any other country in the Caucasus, you say, okay, we implement jury trials because that's a good thing in general. The juries counterbalance judiciaries and kind of present lay participation mechanisms, yet you arrive in a culture where people don't like to report crime because they distrust authority. So what do we do to avoid this situation? For instance, I suggest two things, not that you don't know this, but as a recap, first and foremost, try to navigate the laser field of culture with informal networks to try to gauge the influence of local actors. This is very important. Very often in a different culture, one authority is officially, institutionally charged with a task, but in fact it's absolutely somebody else, some deputy, who's in fact the most influential in pulling leverages. That's in many countries, right? So, and this is not going to be written in a textbook, nowhere. Nobody is going to explain to you in an orientation network, don't talk to this guy, he's useless, but talk to this person. They are key in implementing your recommendations. So how do we navigate this laser field of wasting time? Navigating, engaging people's influence through informal networks. That's one. And two, to stay within the realm of the possible. I think in the relation to Omar's and John's debate, I would say, yes, think tanks, we have to remain in the realm of possible. Advocacy groups, no, they can go as far as to the realm of impossible. They can advocate for things that will be implemented 20 years down the road. But perhaps my suggestion is think tanks have to remain in the realm of possible. And to measure what is possible in this concrete cultural, political, social context is a form of art, I think, and that's where success lies for think tanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dolits. Let's move to Ms. Narmina Gazimova, who's the Grants and Programs Director at the Center for Economic and Social Development in the Republic of Azerbaijan. Please.
Hi, thank you for all having me. I think that it's a really beneficial event for all of us because we have an opportunity to exchange our views and maybe personal experiences. So I would like to start briefly from introducing the think tank, the CSD. CSD is an independent think tank that was established in 2005 to research domestic economic and social issues and to positively influence the public policy decision-making processes and exchange knowledge among the stakeholders. So also among our missions and activities, I would like to mention the policy papers to advise the government of Azerbaijan and the neighboring countries, also the capacity development for the CSOs in public and private sectors, and also advocacy campaigns to protect labor, social, and women's rights. If you speak about the things like COVID and also other crises that are possible in the future, unfortunately, and the ways how the think tank may influence and adapt to this change and maybe the forecast them. So I guess that as my colleagues have mentioned, the adaptation is really valuable because like during the COVID, we thought that the more emphasis was put on the hybridization and technologies, but as Dr. John has mentioned, it will not like replace the communication in life face to face because we have to feel like each other at one sense, and maybe like the communication, live communication cannot be replaced, of course. But I think that establishing like some sort of a platform for the think tanks to establish the further collaboration opportunities might be vital. So it can be like a sort of a network where the think tanks may collaborate and maybe like exchange their opinions. Also, I think that in my opinion, it is crucial in terms of like the difference between the think tanks. I will explain. So we have the representatives of the think tanks from the developed countries and developing, such as like, let's say the EAP countries, the Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. So it is crucial for us to have an opportunity to get like more experience and insight from your institutions, maybe to promote better policies, to be able to produce more beneficial research and promote more policies for the government that might be efficient. So in these terms, I guess that the network that I'm talking about is like really vital. Also, in terms of communication, let's say, it is crucial to emphasize the role of think tank in the promotion of policies and taking into consideration the opinion of those who might not be heard. In this case, I'm talking about the people who are in need, maybe the IDPs, maybe the women who are like at some point under the pressure at work, which is common nowadays, unfortunately. So it is important for think tanks to put more emphasis and attention on those who are in need in order like to be able to promote more efficient policies, I guess. So that is all on my behalf. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Narmina. Now let's move to a Turkish perspective, although he's obviously not talking on behalf of the Turkish government, but we have Dr. Professor Ahmad Evin, who's Professor Emeritus at Sabancı University, Senior Scholar at the Istanbul Policy Center. Please.
Good afternoon, good evening for colleagues further east. It's a great pleasure to meet you here. I see some old friends, but I cannot see the face of Charles Powell, for example. Now, a word about IPC, Istanbul Policy Center. I'm not going to show any slide about it, but I will, after I talk, I will put the reference in chat that you can look it up. It has a quite a good website. Now, the Sabancı University is very new. It was chartered in '97 and admitted its first students in '99. And I was the founding dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. And as dean of a new university, I thought at that time that we needed, as a regional, but also ambitions of being or becoming a global university, we needed an applied research center associated with our social sciences. And that is how Istanbul Policy Center was at least designed. It took another 10 years for it to start functioning properly as a think tank after the appointment of the current director, longtime friend and colleague, Fuat Kemal. Now, IPC does two different kinds of things. And this classification is basically between working on specific issues such as urbanization, local government, particularly municipalities and specific issues relating to municipalities, energy in the sense of, for example, we have a project on decarbonization pathways for Turkey, green energy in Turkey, and so on and so forth. The other type is, of course, more with respect to regional and therefore global issues, international relations, and so on. There is a focus, and that focus began with Turkey-EU relations, and Turkey-EU relations opens up a Pandora's box, as you want to well imagine. It is Turkey and the Black Sea region, which is of global interest, and the bigger bigger Pandora's box is, of course, Turkey's southern neighbors and Mediterranean and the entire gamut of issues that relate to Turkey-EU relations in the Mediterranean. Now, for both of these, one needs a some important understanding of some important approaches. One is that in order to tackle any of these problems, you need to have teamwork. An individual hierarchical setup of a local research project is not going to get any answers to anyone. You need both scientific and technical expertise, and you need interdisciplinary cooperation. You need historians as much as technology and quantitative expertise. Need, as it was mentioned, cultural expertise as well. How do you get this? This is a huge bill that very few, if any, think tanks on either side of the Atlantic can really afford. So the answer, or at least the partial answer to this, is cooperation among think tanks. And that is going to be very important. What sort of a cooperation among think tanks? Well, one is project participation. Project participation is important. I have run various projects with regard to EU enlargement issues. I've worked with a number of, and continue working with a number of think tanks, such as ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for Mediterranean European Policies. I spent and have spent in the past and continue spending time in Athens for that. I have had a long relationship, including being a senior fellow, the GMF. Other examples are IE-MED, the Mediterranean think tank in Barcelona, several years of very close cooperation. I remain still on one of their boards. And on the energy side, I've worked with the think tank of Foundation Eni Endicomate, and so on. That kind of cooperation is important to open, not only open one's horizon, but also get a critical mass of people to work together and ask different questions from different angles. But the second one is equally important in terms of think tanks working with one another. And that is the issue of debate. The debate, not necessarily an argument, but debate is important because from different angles, different questions come. And that is the only way that one can tackle rigorous and many-sided questions. And basically, with the expansion of this points of view in dealing with issues like the Mediterranean, issues like the Black Sea, you're dealing with unstructured problems. And that is the only way to be able to bring independent variables into your own project or into your own scope of reference in order to be able to look at all possible aspects. This I am underscoring because of the new challenges, particularly. There are new challenges because we are in a world that is facing, in many parts, not everywhere, thank God, but in many parts, an erosion of or disregard for institutions. That is tantamount to saying that we also have to deal with unexpected short-term thinking, replacing long-term policies that the world basically had until very, very recently. There is a knee-jerk reaction of transactionalism that we have to take into account. We cannot anymore, as the invitation said, you the thinking in the box is no longer valid. We also have, secondly, limitations of great power leverage and great power influence in this world. Our thinking, from basically the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to the post-Second World War settlement, including possibly up to the Washington Consensus, has revolved around the continuity of great power thinking. That is no longer the case. So, thirdly, and the most important, geopolitics are changing. Geopolitics are changing in many ways that have been mentioned here. But it's also changing not because of competition, but also for competition of resources.
Dr. Evin.
Therefore, yes, this is what I wanted to say. These three points. So to summarize it, one has to get a good, rigorous thinking, cooperate, get into joint projects, but also start a debate among think tanks. That would be my priority in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evin. Let me just remind those of you who've just tuned in that I'm calling upon participants in a random order, just so you know that this is not based on some sort of script, but on a random listing of individuals. So for those of you who are at the back of the list, it's nothing personal, it's just happenstance, just so you know. Let me now please introduce our next speaker, Eileen Ford, who's the director and founder of D&D Internacional, Democracia Digital from the Republic of Peru. Please.
Hello, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Good morning and good afternoon, of course. And first of all, thank you, Trans, for this invitation. I am director and founder of Democracy and Development International, where we promote digital democracy in Peru and soon in Latin American countries. I will try to address the main topics in my intervention. I believe that in Latin America, some of the think tanks have not been able to adapt to the new times and the digital era. Many have lagged behind in past issues, agendas of previous decades, and have not been able to adapt to technology as a tool of change for innovation and for modernity within their organizations. We see many professionals in think tanks, NGOs, and civil society that maintain a classic model of work that does not integrate technology in its different phases to work in teams, to lead, to communicate, to convene other people, to co-create or collaborate among others. Also considering that the methods in the work processes and in the collaboration with other actors and stakeholders. I believe that this is going to change progressively. Many times technology advances and evolves very fast, and think tanks are not able to advance at the same pace. This is something that we see a lot, for example, in the public sector and from public officials, but think tanks should have a different dynamic. I think that the smaller think tanks that were born with a technological boom have taken better advantages of the digital era and are better able to anticipate the future trends and adapt to the new changes. In addition, the fact of being a small organization facilitates the remote work, for example, and avoids many fixed costs that traditional think tanks are used to pay. These are contemporary ways of working, and I think the trend will be towards that little by little. Otherwise, there would not be so many co-working places today. We must also consider that in Latin America, there are many challenges that we face permanently, such as political instability, economic crisis, pandemic and health effects, institutional weakness, distrust towards democracy as a political system, citizen dissatisfaction, social unrest, and new demands of the population. All these destabilizing elements that affect directly or indirectly affects the work of think tanks and civil society. Because sources of cooperation are reduced, many cooperation agencies withdraw from the country. A country risk is high, and this does not attract investors. The focus of attention is dispersed towards the issues that think tanks need to work on. Of course, there are also opportunities to address these complex situations, as Anna mentioned when she talked about the crisis. But it is in a climate that is not so favorable for the future of think tanks. Another element that must be taken into account is that when our countries in Latin America face difficulties situations which are of prime necessity and require priority attention, the development of other issues is postponed, such as those related to science, innovation, technology, digital economy, environmental policies, among others. And that means a delay for the country and, of course, for the topics that are promoted and researched from the think tanks. Regarding our work in cooperation between think tanks globally, I feel that these digital times facilitate our interaction. Why? Because distances are shortened and we can be connected in real time and we receive information permanently. So it is easier to exchange knowledge, ideas, experience, and learning from each other. We must function, all we are participating here, for example, as a global network capable of sharing our good practices and know-how for the different things we know how to do well, and to be able to adapt this work to the reality, the needs and priorities of each of our countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ford. Let me shift the focus back to the Middle East and ask Mr. Osama Al-Ghurari, who is the assistant to the Egyptian Prime Minister and the CEO of Information and Decision Support Center in Egypt, to share his remarks, please. Oh, sorry. Did I repeat?
No, just listen.
Oh, let me just shift the focus back to the Middle East. I was just calling on Mr. Osama Al-Ghurari, if you please would, yeah, thank you.
First, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the trans research team for giving me such an opportunity to participate in this important topic. And it's my honor to be here among those distinguished speakers to learn and gain insights in this very important topic. I personally believe that discussing these type of topics on a global scale is extremely important, given the fact that all think tanks, despite their field of expertise, face a fundamental urgency, whether it is environmental one or a public health one. These existential threats and the other global mega trends currently affecting the world challenge us all to review our operational assumptions and traditional modes of working at the think tanks. I will try to be very short and brief and share with you my thoughts about how think tanks should be prepared for the future, and will try to take in consideration that as a think tank which is operating in Africa, and also you can add the Middle East, we have an enormous range of policy issues to analyze in the coming years. African population are the fastest growing and least wealthy in the country, and we are also expected to be one of the regions worst affected by climate change, making the few available resources even scarcer. With ongoing security threats from civil wars, religious terrorism, and ethnic conflicts in many different regions. So indeed, we are more in need of objective, fact-based policy solutions like any other region in the world. I believe that first, our main focus as a think tanks in the coming period is review our way of engagement, either with the policymakers or the public. We need to regain our credibility as a think tanks, that we are capable of making governments more prepared to the future. And I believe that this requires us to be more of practice-oriented think tanks and innovate in new tactics to generate impact. Of course, I don't mean by that to be busy addressing current issues and shying away from long-term challenges. I mean that we need to focus on figuring out ways to be listened. And this is very important. Second, we need to widen our scope of knowledge transfer by considering the idea of building teams that can work effectively across geographics, languages, scientific disciplines, as we can do this more easily than governments or academic institutions. And this can accelerate the collective learning as well as identifying global solutions. Third, and this will be my last remark, we must collaborate more closely to embed the AI as indispensable aspect in our evidence-based policy advices. Think tanks, especially in emerging economies, will be irrelevant if they didn't quickly adapt to such technologies. This is a very quick points about thoughts and concerns concerning the future of think tanks. Again, thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, Mr. Osama. Next, we have Mrs. Elena Karpinskaya, who's the Deputy Director of Programs at the Russian International Affairs Council in Russia. Please.
Good evening, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting me to such an interesting and important discussion. I would like at the very beginning say a few words about the organization I represent. The Russian International Affairs Council is an international relations think tank on the mission to provide policy recommendations for all of the Russian organizations involved in external affairs. The REAC engages experts, statesmen, entrepreneurs, and members of civil society in public discussion with the aim of increasing the effectiveness of Russian foreign policy. Rapid changes that are taking place in the international environment inevitably pose new challenges to think tanks. The main goal of think tanks at the current stage is to jointly comprehend the changes in international environment, regional crisis, change of balance on international arena, issues of global security, etc. Cooperative networking and network activities would become here a very promising approach to new challenges. The COVID-19, as many speakers have already said, has very much influenced think tanks' development and posed challenges to its activities. But at the same time, it created new opportunities, not only in terms of new forms and ways to organize and hold events, work with target audiences, etc., but also in terms of collaborations development. We at the Russian International Affairs Council have activated our work with think tanks from distant countries. The number of joint events in very concrete, narrow issues has increased significantly while we actively started to use new technologies. As we all understand that the full return to a non-COVID world is not possible, we should, in my opinion, continue to explore and use new forms of interactions. We at REAC are particularly interested to develop new forms of cooperation with foreign counterparts to join our efforts in foreseeing and participating in building the future. What about the changing role of think tanks in the light of increased turbulence and uncertainty in the world? crisis in relations between some countries, growing influence of non-governmental actors, think tanks should consider its role from analyzing the last changes in international relations to proposing options for actions needed, possible solutions to crisis development. We should more consider consequences, plans, and precise implementations. The reports prepared by some of think tanks often describe the different positions and problems, but almost never dare to make any clear proposal with options. It is time to think for think tanks to change its focus from foreseeing to participating in building the future. Foreign policy should be rational and constantly improve. And here the role of think tanks should increase. Mechanisms for dealing with new challenges can become network cooperation, joint discussions with participation of interested think tanks, which result with reports, policy briefs, or some other products with very practical recommendations, which should be advanced and promoted among relevant government agencies and international organizations. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Elena. And now we move to China, to Dr. Liu, who's a senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to join you together today. So I learned a lot from the above speakers because they have showed their excellent insights and also the very excellent experiences in dealing with challenges we have. As you know that China has met a really very shocking challenge in the past 2 years because of the pandemic outbreak. But thanks to the life, I mean, thanks to the people also, we have successfully overcome all this most difficult time. And also China has successfully controlled the pandemic outbreak. And all the life now in China is in normal. All the gardens, restaurants, cinemas are open to the public. So people now enjoy their lives here. And also the economic recovery is also very smooth and very stable. So people are now happy to celebrate this mid-moon festival in 10 days in China, because in the middle of autumn, we have to celebrate our middle moon festival that we will take a moon cake to celebrate as a whole country. Now the whole country is already open and also comes to the normal business actions here. While we have succeeded to control this pandemic, even for China, this is really a big shock at the very beginning because we didn't have any experiences. Nobody in the world can help China how to deal with such pandemic. But Chinese government has really successfully controlled this pandemic. I think because of two major reasons. One is that we believe that scientists rely on experts. That's why that China can really follow a right policy that to put the pandemic control outbreak. Especially, we have also that played a very important role for think tanks. Think tanks have played a very important functions in the past 2 years. I have to say that except government's policy, the think tanks has played a really very important function in the past 2 years and even during the past 5 years. As Chongyang Institute is quite famous in China, we are playing very important function in helping the government to explain their policies and also to explain the policy to the public, to the people. So as a think tank, Chongyang, also as other think tanks, we played like a bridge this bridge cannot be replaced by any other institutions. That means that we can be a bridge between the society and the government, and a bridge with the international community. Chongyang Institute has organized over 10 important major events internationally with all think tanks, with America, with Australia, with the UK, with the European countries, even with the Middle East, many countries, Egyptian and Jordan and also Emirates. So we have discussed the exchange of all the views that to bring the people together to have a better understanding. That's why that China can be united as one person that to fight against the pandemic. So we believe scientists, we believe that the knowledge. That's why the Chinese people, 1.4 billion people, they can follow a very simple idea, simple suggestion from scientists to wear masks, to keep social distance, and seldom to have a gathering. That's to protect our society in order. So this is quite important. As a think tank, we also played a very important function that to convince that to people to believe science, to believe in technologies. So this is why that the Chinese people can really successfully overcome all these difficulties. In order to dealing with all challenges we will meet in the future, I have following 5 simple suggestions as an alphabet: A, B, C, D, E. A, acceptance of differences, because the differences of people, of nations, we should accept it. This is very important. But in the past 2 years, I think some people or some nations could not accept the differences from the different nations or different ideas, different systems. So acceptance is very important, it's the basic. B is to build up trust among nations, among people, between government and the public. So B. C is cooperation with each other. Without cooperation, we can do nothing. Even some Westerns try to decouple from somebody, try to blame somebody, some country for the pandemic or even for the economic difficulties. But blame is nothing. We cannot achieve any new achievements by blaming others. So cooperation is very important. By cooperation, we can further develop. This is D, develop all the relations among nations. And the E is more important, equality among the people. I think our think tank as Chongyang Institute will do its best to follow the A, B, C, D, E to deal the future challenges we will have. We hope that we can have a close cooperation with all the people, ladies and gentlemen here today, so to overcome all these difficulties in the future. Welcome to China to see us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liu, for your take on this. I now have the honor to introduce Dr. Paul Allen McAllister, who's the founder and president of Global Leaders in Unity and Evolvement, based in the United States of America. Please, Dr. McAllister.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be part of this wonderful conversation. And I see several friends on this call, and I know that there's some listening. And it's good to be here with all of you. It's me. For me, it's still in the morning. For you, perhaps in the afternoon or late afternoon. We've heard a lot today, and so I don't want to belabor those things that have already been said. But I do think it's important to note that as we think about foresight or foreseeing participation within think tanks and what the future should look like, I thought it might be wise to talk about our role in planning and participating as one, as a group, in building the future. And the reason is those who participate, as we're doing today, in the process of planning activities to build the future, understand that there is a definite role that we must play to implement the preferred future that we're speaking of. And one of the first principles, as we know, I think as we well understand, is that goal setting is absolutely essential to achieve some kind of success if we're going to begin to accomplish some of the milestones that we've talked about. So we need to begin with the end in mind. Some persons might even think of this in terms of performing what we call gap analysis, where one evaluates the current state of affairs and then compares it to some desired end state, and then goes about the tedious and sometimes arduous task of laying out those necessary steps to narrow the gap between where we are and where we think we would want to be. And I see this as also identifying those problems associated with the gaps that exist. The gaps don't exist in isolation from some issue that we're seeking to address. And so as we address those issues, we identify any risks to people as well as to the planet associated with them. Planning goes beyond then curating those activities, but also addressing those concerns that might require the cultivation of a sense of agency. How do we as human beings begin to tell ourselves we are capable of doing whatever is necessary to resolve the challenges that we face? I think this is a critical role of think tanks in bridging the gap between governments and academia, as well as between governments and citizens within states. It is only then that planning leaps into action with what I would say is a gradual emergence of a total winning strategy to build the future. This is also where the ideas of accountability and competition seep in when we think about think tanks. We are yet competing in a sense, even as we're supportive of one another. And so this is a kind of dualistic process where I'm learning from you, and hopefully you're learning a few things from me, and we're learning from one another in terms of how to wage constructive battle, if you will, if I can use military language, to seize the opportunity to create a preferred future. And so as I begin to wrap up, I want to say that it's very important not only to do gap analysis and not only to think in terms of risk management and competitive flows. I think it's very important to keep those whom we're serving in mind. I've heard it said that we are trying to serve the government, and that is certainly true. But from my perspective, with global leaders in unity and evolvement, I represent a broad consensus of individuals who not only represent government, but who represent the citizenry. And I'll give you a good example of what I'm talking about. One of the issues that we focus on is economic justice. And here in the United States, we've been dealing with COVID as you have, and we have seen many people fall into the unemployment line due to no fault of their own. Oftentimes, our government has extended unemployment benefits. And what we're seeing now is those unemployment benefits being cut off. And unfortunately, many people are still finding themselves in the place where they never intended to be. I think it's important for those people to understand that their government, while working for them, sometimes needs the extra rationale or basis for understanding what's happening in the day-to-day lives of people. And so global leaders tries to be that type of advocate by doing the kind of analysis that brings to bear the nature of the trauma and the circumstances that trouble so many citizens, not only here in the United States as a result of COVID, but also around the world. That's just one instance. I could mention many others, but I think it's so important for you and me to understand that our role is important as we bridge gaps, as we build a preferred future, as we follow the ABCDE principle that we just heard about, which I think is absolutely compelling and marvelous. And I want to say this in conclusion. At Global Leaders, one of the things that we think is so important is building connections between citizens through expressions of faith and interfaith and interreligious dialogue. I think we cannot leave out the spiritual component of things. It's hard to quantify that, it's hard to measure that. It's a kind of qualitative thing, but we are human beings. And as human beings, we have an inner sense of drive and passion to live in a way that is holistic. And so the spiritual component, I would invite us to not leave out of our analysis. I don't know exactly how to do that. That is one of the troubles or challenges, if you will, that I'm working on with those who are partnered with me with GLUE from the faith community. How do we bring the analysis of economics and policy and science and technology and merge or harmonize that with the spiritual or faith-based components, so that as we talk about interfaith and interreligious expressions, we can also accomplish the broader goals of our administration. Currently, Joe Biden, who's a Democrat, but perhaps there may be someone who's an independent or a Republican in the future. In a nonpartisan, apolitical way, we're seeking to build a better America, which we feel at GLUE would lead to circumstances that offset many of the challenges we've experienced most recently in creating more harmony throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McAllister. Now let's move back to Armenia, Yerevan, to Mr. Sergei Melkonyan, who's the Middle East and North Africa Program Director at the Armenian Research and Development Institute. Please, Mr. Melkonyan.
Good evening and good morning for Latin American participants. It's my pleasure to take part in Trends event. Thank you for the invitation. A few words about the Armenian Research and Development Institute. RD provides evidence-based insights on different aspects of Eurasian politics, economy, and regional development, with a special focus on post-Soviet space. From the beginning, speakers were talking on an important topic related mostly to relations with government, taking into account the specifics of MENA region. I would like to add one more point. During the period of uncertainty and growing tensions, I think think tanks have to save their apolitical character and be the effective track to diplomacy. And coming back to Anna Dolits' points, in this case, I think the think tanks will be more valuable and the government will take into account their recommendations. As for how to better or more specifically foresee the future, I would like to add the following. Many discoveries at the present stage occur at the intersection of disciplines, for example, PR and weapons, history and machine learning. Each country and accordingly, each think tank has its own set of distinctive characteristics and areas of research. There are very few centers in the world that can cover whole issues from global health to arms control. The overwhelming majority of the centers mainly solves a narrow range of tests facing the country and then the region, and at the same time not ignoring the global agenda. Therefore, it's important to develop horizontal links between think tanks and on the program or department levels, which are engaged in research in different directions. And at such junctions may appear unique discoveries that will better predict the future. Naturally, one of the central places in this context should be occupied by issues in the field of technology. It was mentioned. around which it's possible to concentrate other humanitarian disciplines. This is, in my opinion, the most promising direction of development will be cooperation between classic centers and technology-oriented institutes. In this case, I totally agree with Dr. Bruni that think tanks should go back to the roots and mostly based on academic research. So I tried to be as brief as possible. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Dr. Jill Murciano, who's the CEO of MITVIN, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. I'm assuming in Berlin, correct?
Actually, yes, in Berlin.
Yes.
But I would say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. We rarely get a chance to step back and take the opportunity to speak about conceptual stuff with the current issues that we are dealing with on a daily basis. So thank you very much for providing us with this space to speak about the overarching topics and inviting me to this intriguing panel. So many insights were already floated, and I'm going to try to connect between a couple of things that were said here. I mean, directly regarding what Paul said about a gap-based approach to the theory of change, what Anna said about the unique role of think tanks in times of crisis specifically, and to connect it with John and Usama's words about the fact that in the end we have the necessity to deal with the system, or with the governmental or other systems altogether. Just one sentence about MITVIN. MITVIN is an Israeli-based think tank which actually aims to challenge paradigms in the fields of Israeli foreign policy and Israeli approach towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict altogether. So we work both on integration of Israel to different regions, Middle East, the Mediterranean, and the relations with Europe, but also promoting Israeli-Palestinian peace, and of course trying to connect both the regional aspects and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict issues into two different vectors. Look, first of all, I'm going to say I'm very intrigued by the idea of speaking about the role of think tanks in, I wouldn't say predicting, but at least presenting some ideas about the future trends. And I have to say I'm pretty humbled by the recent events of the last 2 years on that level. I mean, we have, the cliche always goes about the change in the pace of change. The fact that in our world today, we are experiencing events that used to happen once every 20 or 30 years happened basically every year. I think COVID provided us with a very good demonstration of this cliche actually being a reality. And then really about our abilities as think tanks with our limited resources, with our limited research corpus, to actually try and say something meaningful to the system about the future trends. I mean, you know, we have organizations employing thousands of people with almost unlimited budget, trying to do exactly that, looking at a crystal ball and guessing the future. They are called intelligence services. They almost always fail. So where is our added value in this game? I think, and here I relate a little bit to what Paul and John said, I think it's really about our ability to be sensors of change because of our unique role, because of our unique positioning, because we are not part of the system and yet we are connected to the challenges that are presented by it. I think it's really about identifying the weak signals today regarding the future, the places where the paradigm, not just the concept, but the paradigm of the system, not just an artificial gap, but basic assumptions of the system are wrong or are not relevant, or the paradigm change and the system still resists this change, on a number of different issues. Organization of civil society, to be honest, not so much think tanks, but organizations of civil society, were the first last year to identify that we might have to move from a paradigm of, defeating COVID into a paradigm of living with COVID. We at MITVIN, for example, we're trying to challenge the Israeli paradigm of integration with the region means security-based relation under clandestine rules and presenting the new idea of sustainable incorporation into the region. So we have the ability to challenge those basic assumptions because we are out, or we are basically outside of the system, and we can actually become sensors of change. And of course, later on also develop the relevant recommendation to promote it. Now, the question is, how do we do that in the end? And I think, I don't think I'm going to innovate much here because most of those insights were presented, but one thing is really about impact. The other is really about how we do policy applicable research. And here I'm really connected to the fact, I think it was Aya who mentioned the issue of diversity, the ability to promote different sources of knowledge that come from different life experience. I'm going to give you one short example, which is very close to heart. In the last couple of years, I've been trying to promote this idea of building a think tank which is based on the local knowledge of refugees. You know, in Germany, when you are trying to build Middle Eastern policy, you ask Herr Muller and Frau Schmidt, but you have an incredible resource of knowledge, local knowledge, you know, from unmitigated experience of reality. So really changing the paradigm of who can actually participate in the foreign policy shaping it. The other main issue that we actually implemented in Mitvim, and I think it's one of our foundations of research, is the combination between theory and practice. I think that while we are trying to stay true to our scholarly, let's call it commitment, I think that the combination between practitioners in our fields, in my case, it's ambassadors, former ambassadors and diplomats, with leading minds in academia, could actually create a very interesting, I would call it a mashup, basically, or some kind of a synergy between independent thinking about problems, but also about what is feasible, respecting the system on the level of trying to define or to build the recommendations that they can actually digest, you know, the language, speaking about their language without losing the independent thought altogether. And that's, you know, what I'm describing here, you know, deserves an entire panel of 2 hours. I mean, but, you know, trying to get to this synergy is something that we really focus on in Mitvim with leading academic minds, meeting free thinkers, let's say, meeting formers, you know, ambassadors and people from within the foreign policy. The other issue, of course, is really about impact. A lot has already been said here, so I won't going to repeat my colleagues' incredible insights, really, but I think that collaborative impact becomes a necessity. You know, it's no longer a choice. The problems that we are dealing with today are multinational, if not cross-sectional, you know? So when we speak about climate change, you know, a topic that hits us directly in the region, you know, we are the first one to be impacted by it. The ability to really deal with it within national boundaries is absolutely irrelevant. The ability to create a regional Green Deal, for example, something that we are trying to develop at Mitvim right now. The ability to understand or to learn from other comparative experiences of other think tanks in different regions. Those issues are becoming a necessity. And I think it's really something that in the future we will have to actually create new methods to redefine, maybe to create a new paradigm about what collaborative impact really is and how we engage, relating directly to what Usama said, how do we actually engage with governments in the most efficient way without losing our independent thought and our need of diversity. Last comment, very short comment, if I may, about technology. And this is really maybe a comparative lesson from the Israeli experience. I think that advancing on technology, whether it is in research or dissemination of papers and, you know, reconnecting with our clients is crucial. Don't get me wrong. But I think we should be careful from providing technology too much of an effect or impact here, because I don't think we need to be careful from a situation where technology replaces the conceptual effort. You know, it's conceptual effort first and then technology. In Israel, for example, if you look at we have a certain, I would call it a disease of replacing the need to take hard decisions by introducing technology. Israeli policy towards Gaza. Why developing an approach toward Gaza when you can just develop a better system that can intercept missiles instead of trying to go the extra mile and really deal with political issues and the tough issues? So we need to prevent a situation where technology becomes work avoidance altogether, you know, on the conceptual level. And this is also something that we as think tanks, because we are in the cutting edge of technology also on those issues, it's basically our responsibility. So thank you very much for your insights. It's been incredible. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Jill. Last but not least, we have from Spain, Dr. Charles Powell, who is the director of the Elcano Royal Institute. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Since I'm the 17th speaker, I believe, and this is way past your lunchtime or maybe your tea time, I'm going to be very brief. My name is Charles Powell. I'm very honored to be here, and it's wonderful to see familiar faces, Paul and Liliana and Elaine, whom I had the pleasure of meeting in the flesh in Dubai back in July. It seems like a million years ago. My name is Charles Powell, and I'm the director of Spain's largest international relations think tank, the Elcano Royal Institute. And I'm just going to actually repeat some of the things that I said in Dubai. So if you had fallen asleep when I started speaking in Dubai, here's a second chance. But I'm going to be very brief. The first is, what are we? What's obvious to me, looking at all your faces on the screen, and I wish we could have done this in person, of course, is that we are a very mixed bag. We come from different countries, different political systems, different cultures. We come in all shapes and sizes, and we have probably different resource levels and so on. So this is the first question to my mind is what are we as organizations? We are think tanks. That's what we've always called ourselves. But as I mentioned in Dubai, my dear friend and colleague Anne-Marie Slaughter has been struggling for some time now to come up with a different term, because she finds the term think tank obsolete. This is a 20th century term, and we live in the 21st century. And she acknowledges that she hasn't really been terribly successful so far in finding an alternative term. The one she proposes is change hubs. Think tanks, she says, is an obsolete concept because we are more than think tanks. We also aim to transform knowledge into action. So we are all, to some extent, action tanks. And secondly, the concept, the tank concept, she finds rather limiting and constraining. So what she argues, although she acknowledges that this is not a perfect substitute, is that we should begin to think of ourselves in terms of change hubs. In other words, that we should put the emphasis on change, on how we plan to change the world in which we operate. And of course, she also makes a very good point that even conservatives are in favor of change, right? Very often they want to change things back to the way they were, or very often back to the way they think they were, but probably never were at all. But anyway, change is implicit in all our work. And hubs, and the fact that we are all sitting here from different parts of the world, to some extent, I think, acknowledges that she's onto something. We are basically now operating as hubs. So this is my first contribution to today's proceedings. The second point I want to make is, can we define what we all do? Here we are, a group of very different think tanks. As I said earlier, we cover different themes, we have different approaches, but I would argue that we are all essentially public problem solving organizations. We are all public problem solving organizations. And our fundamental aim, I think our key aim, is to develop solutions to social, economic, and political problems. For some of us do this, as I was saying, from perhaps an international relations perspective. Others are more interested in climate change, energy issues, et cetera, but we are all basically trying to develop practical, useful solutions to major, meaningful social, economic, and political problems. Additionally, I think we are all in the business of trying to inform and educate two very different constituencies, decision makers and the general public. I think it was John who said we all work for our governments. And yes, this is true to some extent. Let's call the decision makers, it's slightly more elegant. And of course, that can include sub-state level governments. But the general public is very important. Thirdly, I think we're in this business to promote new ideas. As I said, even conservatives have new ideas, obviously. And finally, I think it's in our raison d'etre to foster and nurture informed debate on matters of public interest. Now, the problem, of course, is that this is a hell of a lot to take on, especially if we are relatively small or modest institutions. But these are all goals that I think remain valid in this post-COVID world in which we are now moving. To some extent, of course, and I think all of us around this virtual table know that we are competing with universities and we are competing with the media. But there's nothing wrong with that. I think, many of us come from the university world, from the academic world, and many of us have a media presence. So that's fine. I think this is something structural and something that we need to get used to. And let me very briefly go back to who we do all of this for. Yes, decision makers. Sorry, I'm busy. Yes, decision makers, but also not just our national or subnational decision makers. More people follow what we publish on El Cano on our website from outside Spain than from within Spain. And this as a think tank executive poses some interesting challenges for me. You know, who exactly is the audience out there? And again, we are trying to inform and educate the general public, but it's not just the Spanish general public, it's the general public in Europe and indeed worldwide. So my final observation is that what I'm increasingly finding is that we need to really begin to think of ourselves as transnational organizations with a transnational audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powell. Okay, I think we've come to an end in terms of brief comments made by each and every one of you. And I really thank you very much for sticking to the 5 minutes limit. It's unfortunate you didn't have more time to kind of present some of your views in a more detailed manner, but I'd like to kind of go back and pick up on the discussion we had an hour ago that when Omar brought up the issue of cultural change. Dr. Anna talked about the laser field of culture. I mean, some would call it the minefield of culture. Obviously, there are political constraints, but how can think tanks, and again, going back to this whole discussion, also Dr. Bruning having shared his opinion, how can think tanks navigate or balance this thin line between being independent, being creative, and producing relevant policy work or even academic work in that sense, and not being constrained by the forces that are out there? I mean, any suggestions or perspectives from your experiences at large? Yes, please. Omar, go ahead.
Yes, very briefly. The Islamic or Middle East didn't used to be this way. 1,000 years ago, it was at the forefront of science. One important reason for why that was the case and no longer is the case, there are many reasons, but one of them is that in the 9th century, 10th century, private citizens used to fund scientific inquiry. Philanthropists, merchants, and nobility used to fund science as part of their philanthropic activity. Today, the only people that fund science are the government. Even businesses barely fund science. And so that's why you get some of the dysfunction that I described. And so one way to head in the right direction would be to convince philanthropists. There are still philanthropists in the Arabic world. They just fund things like mosques and poverty relief programs, and they don't have much of an affinity for funding science. So addressing that would help. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Liliana had, let's move to Liliana had her hand up, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, please.
Yes, I did. Thank you very much. I just wanted to touch upon Dr. John's very provocative comment that he said that we serve the government. And I think that it takes us back to what Charles was saying, that what are we and what is our mission? I'd like to say that, for example, in the Latin American region, we don't see ourselves, and by saying ourselves, I mean think tanks, as serving the government. On the contrary, I think we see ourselves as watchdogs, trying to get the government to be transparent in all of its work, and also accountable. And another thing that I wanted to say is that I think that most of us have really talked about collaborating, right? Collaborating at different levels and globally, regionally, etc. But just to open up the debate, I'd like to say that there are many challenges also related to collaboration. First of all, and it takes us back to funding. Funding is a challenge for collaboration. Also time. Some of the think tanks are quite small and have very reduced staff. And also we have to also speak about the staff capabilities. Another thing that I would like to mention would be related to the lack of familiarity with out-of-region economic, social, and political context. Another variable that I would mention would be related to limited access to cross-regional databases, mainly information sources, also, of course, cultural differences, and also we need to acknowledge the difficulties posed by the political background in certain countries. Just also thinking about what Dr. Omar had said before, and how can we as think tanks work around these challenges? Thank you.
Thank you, Liliana. I think Dr. Iyad wanted to also say something, correct?
Yes, yes. I would like just to comment about what is missing between the think tank and the higher education institutions. Like us, for example, we are an institution of alliances of different higher education institutions, and it's difficult that we have only little work with think tanks. So part of it, what we do research on transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research, but we don't have any interconnected with think tanks, only on minimum level. So what I suggest that think tanks should have divergent interconnections between universities, higher education, and those centers that are on those universities that can collaborate, like what we try to do with, we call it the 3 regional project, North Africa, Middle East, and Europe, where we connect the 3 triangles together. They are different professors, different universities, different institutions. As always, Lillian said, this is also the problem that we face is funding. So this might bring more funding if you have divergent partners in, and we can have more research and academic research as well. So we have to integrate the think tank with the academic institutions and make some research together that can collaborate in better future in developing these aspects of research.
Thank you, Dr. Iyad. Dr. Lee, you would like to say something? Liu?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think this question is quite important, especially for China. You know, I have been personally working in Europe for many years, since 1982, so in Germany and in Switzerland. So we know some differences. But nowadays we are very confused, not me alone, but many Chinese, that whatever the Chinese people do or have done, always misunderstood by some Western media or the Western countries. It's because of different culture or different opinion or even something else. Because whatever we have done, you can see from the international, community, international media, that we find that so many negative misunderstandings about China. Even we have done, for instance, the poverty alleviation, even something in Xinjiang, in Tibet. Whatever we have done to promote the local lives, if you come to see the cities, the life there, anybody will change their own ideas. But still, we are blamed, we are criticized by some extremists in the West. So some Chinese really very disappointed, very confused, even for me, that we could not convince it. How can we convince this? That's why we see that the think tank will play a very important role. In the past years, we have organized many seminars and symposiums to invite the foreign guests, foreign friends to visit all these disputed places and areas, to see by yourself, to look at the real facts. That's why we can see that so difficult for us to convince some people in the Western country. In China, there is a very famous political word that seek truth from facts. I think everybody of you know this word, you see, that to seek truth from the fact. But for me, you see, I have something different. To seek facts from facts is most difficult. Even we don't know which things are really facts. Even we have facts, we have done many things that are wonderful for the people to save the people's life, but still we are misunderstood by the Western. So I think a think tank is not only a bridge, but also, as an Australian friend, the doctor said, to serve the government is one part of the government organization. So in China, in some people will say If not, I'm not sure whether it's right. Think tanks sometimes could be regarded as a shadow government. It's a complement or supplement to the government function. So in this way, I think we should have really a very well understanding between each other and also collaboration with each other to exchange all the views about the policy making.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Aline, would you like to chime in and say something briefly in regards to this issue? Yes, please. Go ahead. Aline?
Elaine, yeah, okay. Thank you so much. Yes, a short comment in reference to what Dr. Ijad Al-Dahani mentioned. I coincide with him about the need to work in a interconnection with universities for the work that think tanks do. But I consider that this can also be broader. I mean, for example, from digital democracy, we work with different actors, with different stakeholders. We work with private sector, with public sector. We work a lot with the technical community to have different kind of activities. For example, we make hackathons, we make challenges, we make tech camps to promote good practices and the development of solutions and tools for technology and to resolve different issues from the country. So the technical community is a good ally for us, for the work we do. And of course, this depends on the mission of the think tank, the main mission of the think tanks, and depends as well of the purpose of each project, of each initiative. We started in Peru with digital democracy 9 years ago, and we started with 2 lines of actions. And at the moment, we have more than 15 lines of actions and projects and initiatives all over the country. And soon we will launch a new project for Latin American countries. So can you imagine, we must work and we must be open to work with different stakeholders and different actors to get to reach our main objectives. That's it. Thank you so much.
Maybe we'll have 2 more comments. I think Aya had her hand up and so did Dr. Bruni, but let's have Aya first maybe share some comments. Yeah.
Thank you. I do agree with some of the comments that were mentioned, and I have to get back to a comment that Dr. John actually made around objectivity and how it could be. I know it's a double-edged sword sometimes, but it's a good tool when you're trying to bring to certain governments' attentions some of the issues that are considered a bit sensitive or that would get sort of blocked from the government, is to present them with objectivity, maybe pull on different diverse or various approaches to present a more sort of wholesome or objective sort of recommendations. And then another point made by one of our colleagues around the importance of establishing local connections and knowing who to speak to and when to speak to them, knowing how and when to engage the public. That's very important. And then as well, how to channel all of this feedback up to policymakers. And then the third thing that smaller and more localized think tanks could do is contextualization. When we draw on the different experiences from our global partners, it's also important to provide that service of contextualizing some of these case studies or successes and channel them into a framework that would actually work and would be relevant to our policymakers and constituencies. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. John Bruni, would you like to kind of respond to some of the comments? Yeah. You're muted, I think.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Look, thank you very much for that. And look, to everyone that's sort of engaged in the discussion, it's been fantastic so far. What we've done now is we've laid it bare for everyone to see what are the things that really drives think tanks. What do we expect out of think tanks? What are our roles? These are things that, unfortunately, in the day-to-day grind of running a think tank, we ourselves don't have enough time to sit down and pose these questions. But one thing that I did pick up, it's amazing when you sit here among a panel of people and we're all talking about things, we're not talking necessarily specifically about the one thing, and that is communication. One word, simple word, but I would argue that strategic communication, whereby the think tank acts as the nexus between decision makers at the one level, without losing their objectivity and without losing their scholastic might, if you will. And then you've got to have that strategic communication down to the general public so they understand what role you're playing, and therefore they may be able to help support your mission in whatever state, in whatever capacity they can. And then, of course, we have the strategic communication to funders, whether they be government or whether they be private as well. This is arguably a think tank's most important thing it brings to the table. If it cannot communicate with its funding source, if it cannot communicate with decision makers for fear of upsetting somebody who happens to be in power, and if, for instance, the general public don't really care what you're doing, mission's over effectively. So really, we need to really start thinking about ways in which we get that strategic communication out there in order for think tanks to better shore themselves up. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much. I wish I could be here for another 2 hours. It's already 12:30 a.m. and I'm on another call and people are calling me. It's just driving me nuts. So anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bruni. Maybe we'll have Dr. Powell, a few comments before we close the session for today, but you were last, so I'll leave the floor to you to make like the closing comments on and share your perspective.
It's a bit, I don't want to start a controversy, especially since we're wrapping this up. Our Chinese colleague very eloquently spoke out in favor of trying to avoid trying to make sure that think tanks don't mimic the kinds of confrontational policies that some of our governments adopt. But I just wanted to point out that 10 European scholars, some of them are close friends of mine, and 4 European organizations have been sanctioned by the Chinese authorities, including Europe's most important think tank when it comes to studying China, the Mercator Institute for Chinese Studies, better known as MERICS. And as a result of these sanctions, these experts cannot actually travel back to China anymore. So I'm not sure that this is a very, very conducive to dialogue between think tanks. Thank you very much.
I think we still have a few minutes extra. Dr. Evin, I think you had your hand up. Would you like to make just a few comments?
I was going to basically say something very obvious, but let me also second Charles Powell said about MERICS. I'm very much upset by the fact that a major think tank is disallowed to teach all of us globally about China. We need that information, and we need an objective perspective. All I wanted to say basically is that where there is no freedom of inquiry, there is no good science. By extension, there is no good social science. By extension, there is hardly good humanities or arts. We have to keep that in mind. And we also have to keep in mind in that connection that where those places where there are restrictions will be dependent for their development on those places where there are no restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evin. This brings us to a close for today. I would like to thank all of our panelists for their very interesting presentations and their thoughts and comments. On behalf of Trends, we would like to express our sincerest gratitude for participating in the e-symposium, and I hereby say have a good night, a nice day, and ma salama. Bye-bye.
Thank you.